we have a lack of speakers.
Well, Mr. President, good morning. Syria. The levels of political and military assistance now invested by Russia to support the brutal Assad regime ensures that neither of these actors can be ignored in seeking a solution to this bitter conflict. I've been highly critical of Russia's actions in Ukraine in the past, but we cannot allow these difficulties to preclude working with Russia now in other areas of foreign policy where necessary. This was true of the nuclear agreement with Iran, and is now true, sadly, of Syria. Reports that Russia is indiscriminately targeting areas of Syria that are known to be controlled by groups other than ISIS are a major concern to the West. Furthermore, as reports emerge suggesting that Russia will consider integrating its troops within loyal battalions to Assad, rebel Syrian groups announce plans now to jointly fight Russian forces, and Turkey cites violations of its airspaces by the Russian Air Force. We only begin now to comprehend the many effects and potential for conflagration of further war that Russia's latest moves could have. A will from the European Union to cut a deal for a transitional role for Assad in exchange for immunity is worth considering, however unpalatable that may appear. For me, the lesser of two evils.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tannock. Now we'll use the following procedure. We'll wait for the presidency, and we'll wait until the presidency arrives, and then we'll give the floor to Mr. Schmit. And the speakers who arrive in the meantime, who weren't there at the beginning, I'll take those. And those who have been missed, oh, it's just too bad. Mrs. Schaake for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. I do note with regret that there's no one to address here, to be honest. I think it's a very important debate on Syria. Because the war in Syria must be stopped, and our group has called for more EU leadership for years. We are paying a very high price for the lack of that. Not only is it unacceptable how many people continue to be killed, now with the help of Russian bombers, it is equally unacceptable how little unity and leadership we have seen from the EU side. The High Representative should strive to find a common EU position and develop a comprehensive plan. Our group wishes to see a political solution. And building on local ceasefires and ending the air raids on civilians should stop the bloodshed. No-fly zones are a part of ensuring that. I find it unacceptable that Russia and Saudi Arabia, and now the US, are taking diplomatic initiatives and that we are absent. Russia and Saudi Arabia are certainly no honest brokers, but can we be surprised that the vacuum we left was filled by others? While there are no simple solutions, there are certainties we cannot ignore. The needs of the millions of people on the run for Assad's bombs and ISIS brutalities far exceed the funds available. We call on you to organize a major donor conference which should contribute to much more serious commitment to refugees in the Middle East and to the countries hosting them. Also, military success often does lead to more refugees. It is key to ensure there is anticipation and coordination. We need a comprehensive EU plan to end the war in Syria now.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Schaake.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Schaake. And now I'll give the floor to Minister Schmit. He will speak on behalf of the Vice President, High Representative for Foreign Policy. You have the floor. Thank you very much, President.
Honourable members, the terrible conflict in Syria you just described is now in its 5th year, and at this point there is still little sign of peace on the horizon. That's true, unfortunately true. 250,000 people have been killed. 12 million, half of the country's population, have been displaced. 4 million of these left to Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. And as Europeans, we are all aware, many of these refugees are now trying to reach Europe to look for peace and a more human life. Many are predicting new waves of refugees from inside Syria in the months to come. Europe has to handle the humanitarian consequences of this conflict, including the flows of refugees. A high-level conference on the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Balkans route takes place tomorrow in Luxembourg. We have spent €4 billion so far, making us the biggest international donor. And faced with the additional flows of refugees this year, we are going to spend more. We will spend more on immediate aid for refugees, providing them with a shelter and with food. But we will also spend more on essential services such as health and education. An additional €1 billion will be mobilized. The first contract opened through the new trust fund for Syria deals with schools and education. Syria is losing a whole generation to war and exile. Only education can give a future to a whole country. We expect that by the end of this year, the 500 million that we are putting into the fund will be matched by Member States' contributions. It is a huge financial effort, reflecting the scale of the crisis. This effort will not, in itself, halt the refugee flow from Syria. Only when there is hope for an end to the war and prospects to return home will the current refugee crisis head towards a conclusion. There is growing consensus in the international community that ending the Syrian war needs a two-track approach. This has been verified during a number of meetings over the past 2 weeks in New York and in Brussels. On the one hand, we need to successfully fight the terrorist threat of ISIL, called Daesh, a threat, by the way, which is spreading beyond the region. And in parallel to this, we need to do all we can to support the political process led by the UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura to get the Syrians talking to each other again. On the fight against terrorism, the EU is not militarily involved, but we can and do actively support with non-military means the objectives of the global coalition against Daesh. Our engagement goes far from reducing the threats of radicalization and the recruitment of new foreign terrorist fighters in the European countries to seeing what can be done to stop the flow of revenues to Daesh. But it is in supporting the UN-led peace efforts that the EU has most to contribute. Different regional and international actors have a substantial influence on the Syrian parties. They must take on their responsibilities and finally bring all the players to the table for serious negotiations. The EU is able to engage with all relevant regional and international powers. We are talking to the Russians, the Iranians, the Saudis and the Turks. I think Iran understands that this is going to be their first test to see if they can play a more constructive role after the nuclear deal. The EU also underlines the importance of preserving state structures and functions in order to ensure security, order and the provision of basic services to the people of Syria during a political transition. We can work on that together with the international community. Similarly, we can also make our contribution to bringing the different strands of the Syrian political and military opposition together behind a common vision and purpose. In July, representatives of the two main umbrella groups of the political opposition, the SOC and the NCC, have met in Brussels, having been brought together by the High Representative. During the meeting, they agreed a draft roadmap for the future political transition. None of this is going to be easy. The war in Syria is a very complex matter. It has multiple players with many diverging objectives. The latest phase has been marked by military escalation, both by Syrian and by non-Syrian participants. A military escalation in the civil war will lead nowhere. It will only prolong the agony of the conflict. Fighting terrorism is one thing. In Syria, that means fighting the groups defined as terrorists by the United Nations, including Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra. It does not mean fighting alongside the regime in the civil war. That will only provoke a matching increase in the arms supplies by some regional powers to the opposition. There are measures that would promote de-escalation and peace, an end to the bombing and shelling of civilian areas, an end to the use of barrel bombs. Commitments of this kind could go a long way towards fostering sufficient trust to allow the beginnings of a real dialogue on transition. We can also intensify our humanitarian diplomacy. We can seek ways to provide access and protection, as well as to promote humanitarian principles and consensus on the guideline for the delivery of aid. As recalled by the European Council, the Union is committed to doing its part in supporting the UN-led efforts. I believe that in the face of so much suffering on our doorstep, it is our duty to respond. You can count on our collective engagement on this. I thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing your views.
Vielen Dank, Herr.
Thank you very much, Minister Schmit. And now Mr. Brok for 2 minutes. President in office, colleagues, it's true, in fact, that the European Union is doing a lot for refugees and doing a lot by way of humanitarian assistance, but as we see, not enough. If you look at food aid supplies in the camps around Syria, if you look at the food aid situation there, and also there's been cuts that have been carried out by member states to their budgets, and that's led to cuts in food supply. But I don't want to concentrate on that now. In the second part of your aid, President in office, you made it clear that we had to bring about a peace-building process. If we don't succeed in that, then everything else will just be palliative in effect, but it won't lead to any solutions. And we have to see that we have a mix here of power plays, and that makes it very difficult to pull that off. First of all, there is a battle for regional power, and this involves Saudi Arabia and Iran and struggling against each other, and then a rather opaque role of Turkey in this business. And if we don't succeed in bringing these countries together, getting them to stop their proxy wars, and in fact Daesh is only going to flourish and it will end up threatening them, and we have to get the big powers together. I have the impression that there's a second level of proxy wars here. It involves Russia and America, and that plays a role too. To what extent can Russia stabilize its position of power in the long term through its action in Syria, and how can America prevent that? So that's another level where there is lack of unity. And also you've got to look at the decisive role for the European Union. We must turn to the Russians. This has nothing to do with the Ukrainian conflict and giving in then. No, we've got to bring Russia and the United States together, as we did it with the question of nuclear weapons with Iran. We have to find a solution there, and then we've got to get those who are fighting in the region together. So we've got these two different levels have got to be brought together. It's of great significance that we do this, and I have this impression that this is something we haven't paid enough attention to so far.
Herr Kollege Brok.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brok. And now Mr. Bostinaro. Well, he hasn't arrived, so for 1 minute we'll hear from Mrs. LÖSING.
Thank you. In 2012 already, voices were issuing warnings about the possible consequences of what was then a protest movement against Mr. Assad. And what happened? Exactly what we've seen unfolding. And this on the basis of Western support. A US intelligence report from 2012 already forecasted the rise of Islamic State, the creation of Islamic State, and in fact it said that this was something which corresponded to the interests of Turkey and the West, because it would have led to the isolation of President Assad. So here what we're seeing is a strengthening of radical Islamist forces, and that was something which was actively propagated. And now what we're seeing is that a conflagration has arisen in Syria. We're seeing air attacks, airstrikes taking place, and we call for an immediate end to that. We have to look at the UN mandate. Speakers cut off.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you very much, Mrs. LÖSING. And now for 2 minutes, Mr. Smith.
President, colleagues, thank you. In the tragedy that is Syria, it's difficult to know where to start. 310,000 people killed, countless more lives ruined through injury or bereavement. 4.5 million refugees, 7 million internally displaced people. The scale of this tragedy is little wonder that the humanitarian consequences are quite literally washing up on our shores. And I very much echo comments of colleagues on the humanitarian consequences of this tragedy. But our group has always stressed that the only solution in Syria, the only way in which we can create a safe environment for people to return to, is a political solution. There was a time when concerted intervention by the international community could have helped, but we remain deeply sceptical on current airstrikes against the so-called Islamic State. We've seen 7,000 US strikes. We now see informal US and UK and French engagement also, but to little avail. We're tackling the symptoms rather than the cause. Adam Garfinkel, a US diplomat turned academic, has criticised US policy on ISIS, and I think it applies to French and British policy also. Tackling ISIS is akin to thinking that you can alter the position of a shadow by doing things to the shadow. We are not tackling the right things. Likewise, we should not be fooled by the actions of Russia in this conflict. Sergei Ivanov, the Kremlin's chief of staff, says, I quote, military aim of our operations will exclusively be to provide air support to Syrian government forces in the struggle against ISIS, and yet Russian attacks have been in areas with no ISIS presence, against Free Syrian Army positions in Latakia, Homs, Hama and even Aleppo. The Assad regime has killed 8 times more people than ISIS. This Parliament hosted the Caesar exhibition, evidence of brutal torture by this regime. Assad is not a partner in peace, he is the primary obstacle to it, and we must not drift towards the Assad regime in order to try to build a viable peace. We must facilitate a wider international engagement and raise our game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Castaldo. Thank you, President. In 2015, Syria, the power balance in Syria, it actually sort of determines the balance of power in the whole region. At the moment, there's a stalemate. Russia wants to maintain its bases in the Mediterranean. Iran doesn't want to lose its main co-religionary ally. And the United States, France, United Kingdom are terrorized by the idea of having to recognize the nth strategic defeat. And then Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, we should be telling them off, reprimanding them for their support to ISIS. The UN doesn't know what to do, and the solution has to involve an agreement with Assad and those who support, if we're going to be realistic. And I think people should have become aware of that earlier, that we needed to involve Assad in a solution, and we wouldn't have had a war lasting so long. We wouldn't have had millions of refugees and a war without end. Will we get that before the proxy wars degenerate even further into an Iran-Saudi Arabia war, or even worse, degenerate into a third world war? Thank you very much, Mr. Castaldo. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Salvini. Thank you, President. Above all, I wonder where Mrs. Mogherini is. She's supposed to be representing us, but she obviously has other engagements. And secondly, I say thank you to Russia. It's the only country which is defending the principles of peaceful coexistence and using force when it's necessary. Is anyone really thinking about having a dialogue with ISIS? And do you think those people who crucify and burn alive people can be involved in a dialogue to create peace? And for those who want to understand that there is an Islamization, a forced Islamization underway, because people instead of going thousands of kilometers to get into Western Europe should be going perhaps to Saudi Arabia and the Emirate States who have infinite wealth and space. No, this is forced Islamization of Europe. The 7th of October, 3 centuries ago, outside Vienna, Europe was saved from Islamization, and I don't want this useless absentee parliament to actually bring about something that we managed to avoid at the gates of Vienna centuries ago.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Castaldo.
Thank you. Would you allow a question from colleague Smith?
Bitte, Herr Kollege Smith.
Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful to the colleague for giving way. I rise to give you a point of information that perhaps didn't reach you. Ms Mogherini has communicated to our services that she's ill presently. That's why she's absent. So perhaps you would care to withdraw your rather ungentlemanly remarks which you made earlier.
The problem of Mrs. Mogherini, I wish her all the best, is that when she's well and she's present, it's just as if she were absent. She's totally useless, and she's useless to those people she's supposed to repress. I hope she has a speedy recovery. I also hope there'll be somebody who will actually effectively represent the interests of the European Union in the world, not just with the odd phone call when things have already happened.
Herr Castaldo, Herr Kollege Castaldo, gestatten Sie eine weitere...
Mr. Castaldo, there's another question.
Herr Kollege Salvini.
Sorry, Mr. Salvini. Mr. Salvini, would you allow a further question from Mr. BALCZÓ?
Bitte, Herr Kollege BALCZÓ.
Go ahead, Mr. BALCZÓ.
Herr Kollege BALCZÓ.
Mr. BALCZÓ. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. I'd like to ask a substantive question. Do you agree with the fact that Italy actually has to be regarded as playing a very important role in the world at the moment? Because if you look at the ambitions to try to diminish the power of President Assad, do you think there would be an opportunity for peace and stability to ensue in a situation when so many people are fleeing from President Assad? Do you think that there's some way of speakers cut off?
Herr Kollege Salvini.
Mr. Salvini.
Guardi, collega, le
Well, I'll have to say that with the words of a Christian who escaped from Syria, not from Assad, but from Islamist terrorists. He's saying that Assad's not the best person. We all know that, but ISIS is worse. Is there anyone here who put on the same level as Bashar al-Assad and ISIS? Well, they need to be put into a mental asylum because they're dangerous.
Thank you, Mr. Salvini. Now, Ms. Dodds, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. And after a very shaky start, it's good to see this debate get off the ground. The situation in Syria is certainly one of the most pressing of our time, and a redoubling of efforts must focus on the core of the problem. A Syria ruled by a brutal dictator, the fanatical evil of ISIL, who are not only destroying the ancient heritage of Syria, but murdering its people and targeting groups of Christians and other minorities in a most brutal, almost medieval fashion. Certainly something that we have not experienced in a long time. The manifestation of this is a flood of people displaced to surrounding nations and now to Europe. Minister Schmit, you outlined some of the efforts in relation to Europe in this terrible humanitarian crisis, but you did not outline any of the pressures that you're putting on the surrounding states in the Gulf to do much more to help in this difficult situation. And there are many of us who believe that...
Thank you, Ms. Dodd. Now, Mr. Preda for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. I'd like to say that the Russian military intervention is very bad news indeed. This makes the situation even more fragile, and this at a point in time where we're concerned with the source of the wave of immigration in the EU, the source being, by and large, Syria. Now, the idea is to support Assad. That is the fundamental objective at play here, and this military intervention under these conditions serves only to very clearly produce more refugees. I think, politically speaking, this Russian intervention creates a complication in the crisis, and I think this is a gesture against Europe. I think that's quite obvious. I don't think we should deceive ourselves here. This is not the first time Russia goes solo, and that's why there are some people who feel that Ukraine and Syria should be put on the same level. Russia is basically acting without involving other international actors, without negotiating with them. And before we were trying to solve this problem diplomatically, but now Putin comes in and takes a military solution. So I'm very worried about this military intervention because it has already violated the Turkey airspace. They're a member of NATO. And so this calls into play our North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. And when I see colleagues here defending Putin pacifism, that gives me the impression that they live in Moscow rather than in Europe. I'm very disappointed with those points of view. I think we need to work in the area of diplomacy, and I don't think we should support this military intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Preda. Now for 2 minutes, Mr. Howitt.
Thank you, President. So often in this chamber and in its like, we have wrestled with the escalation of conflict in the Middle East through the emergence of proxy war. Now, with the Russian intervention in Syria and the potential for a clash in its airspace, we face the danger of the biggest proxy war of all. Little did we think in debating the possible setting up of a no-fly zone that the planes that could be shot down would be MiG jets from Moscow. Little did we think in debating how to combat the problem of foreign fighters that they could be so-called volunteers in uniforms with or without the insignia of the Russian army. Everyone involved in the Iran talks says that Russia undertook a constructive role in spite of the disagreement over Ukraine. Everyone involved in the Syria crisis believes that Iranian and Russian interests must be made to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I went to Tehran with the Foreign Affairs Committee on the nuclear talks, and I've taken on the rapporteurship on Iran because I believe in the power of diplomacy. However difficult it might seem, that must today apply to Russia too. Some will say that this week's dramatic events risk simply exposing Europe's powerlessness. Today we have to say that bold diplomacy can be a sign of strength, not of weakness, just as much as the dropping of bombs, I think more. Today, this European Parliament must call for Europe to engage in that bold diplomacy, and in doing so, to call on others to respond in kind. What are the fundamental principles that must guide our action? That there must be a political transition in Syria to end the situation as it is today, but not to return to the one as it was yesterday. That there is less rather than more consensus over an alternative future, and that this should urgently inform our discussions. That an imperfect and painful political solution which genuinely sought to be inclusive was ultimately possible in Iraq and can be in Syria too. That there is no purely military solution to this war, that there is a common foe in terrorism, so let's have an honest debate on how it can be combated and genuine common efforts to do so, and that civilians are being endangered when all efforts should be towards their protection. Finally, President, my party supports the humanitarian zone.
Thank you, Mr. Howitt. Now the next speaker for 1 minute, Ms. Fotyga.
Thank you very much, Chairman. A few days ago in the UN, we heard the announcement of the success of international community and its mobilization in the solution to devastating crisis in Syria. To us, the member states of the EU, besides aggression in Ukraine, this is the biggest threat to our security. Russia contributed a lot to it by the agreement about sharing intelligence information with Iran, Assad, Syria and Iraq. However, it seems that it doesn't work. The engagement of Russia and the way it executes bombing shows that it tries to destroy the opposition, not Islamists. The Deputy Minister for Defense asked for withdrawing American troops and the supply of intelligence information.
Für 1,5 Minuten.
Now, for 1.5 minutes, Ms. de SARNEZ.
Monsieur le Président. Thank you, President. Well, the situation has never been so dangerous and as confused in Syria as it is now, with fighting that will carry on, will intensify with more and more casualties, more and more wounded, and each international player, each regional power playing its own game with its own ideas on the ground, defending their own interests, always in contrast with those of the others. And the Russian intervention will, of course, change the situation completely. The balance of power will change on the ground, but also that will lead to more mobilization. I'm thinking of perhaps involvement of Saudi Arabia in order to support the opposition rebel groups, and that will mean more death, more war. Let's add to that the chance of a unified Syria is getting further away. Given this situation, what should we do? Europe is cruelly absent from this scene, although it is directly concerned, in particular, by all the refugees that want to get to Europe. It's high time that our voice was heard. We're going to have to work at finding a solution to the conflict, fighting with all the parties involved in 3 directions. Firstly, we have to urgently find an agreement between the major powers, in particular US and Russia, to fight effectively against Daesh. And then secondly, we have to find a political transition procedure which will guarantee the protection of minorities and guarantee the setting up of a confederal government. And finally, if we want to find a solution to the conflict which is sustainable, we've got to allow the different countries that are involved to maintain, in the solution, maintain some protection of their vital interests. And it's time that Europe's voice was heard. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. de SARNEZ. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Kuso-Permi.
Thank you, President. From the outset, we denounced the financing and training and providing of arms to terrorist groups to topple a government that they don't like, but that is legal, international speaking. I think some people are indifferent to international law, but there's the coalition against the IS, and I tried to find out how they were coordinating with our governments, but I couldn't get an answer. But you may not like it, but Russia's intervention is legitimate because it comes at the petition of a government. So I think it's an insult that representatives of the US and NATO ask for the al-Qaeda opposition not to be bombed. Would you like to know how many people died on the 11th of March and who killed them? Let's go back to Geneva, an international coalition led by the UN, but it does not include the terrorists.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Carver.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we have seen this week, Russia has grasped her opportunity to shore up her Middle East ally through supportive airstrikes, whilst reminding us of President Putin's potential to commit large troop numbers to Syria. And to further complicate matters, we must also consider reports that some Chinese military personnel will soon be arriving on the scene. We must wake up, Mr. President, and smell the coffee. The West is now on the back foot, with these 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council potentially set to not just fight against Islamic State in Syria, but also possibly change the balance of power in the Middle East if they can determine Syria's post-war settlement. The lack of ability from the West to formulate a long-term strategic plan has left us with a stark choice of whether we are now happy to see President Assad remain in power. Whatever the eventual outcome, the political dynamics of the Middle East may well be about to change for the foreseeable future. And from what I'm hearing here today, it seems to me that all you can do is mumble something into your coffee. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Carver.
Thank you, Mr. Carver. Now for 1 minute, Mr. de GRAAFF. President, after a year-long hopeless battle, Russia has also taken up arms against IS in Syria. This might be the decisive factor in the annihilation of this enemy of humanity. But is the war in Syria a problem for the EU because, as a result of it, hundreds of thousands of migrants are streaming into the EU? Are they coming here to flee from war? No, absolutely not. Because Syrians who have fled their home country have been living in safety for years in Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon. The problem is free money, free housing and free care in Germany and other EU member states. The problem is that the EU is not closing its internal and external frontiers. Now here we are contemplating abolition of the visa requirement for Turkey, and this would be opening the door to an even greater influx of unwanted economic immigrants and the Islamicization of the EU. The Commission should follow the example of Prime Minister Orban, who does know how to get to grips with this invasion. We need barbed wire and patrolling of our national frontiers to prevent European countries going to ruin as a result of Islam's destructiveness.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege de GRAAFF.
Thank you, Mr. de GRAAFF. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Voigt.
Ja, danke.
Thank you, President. I had the opportunity 2 months ago to visit Syria at the invitation of the Syrian government, and I was able to see for myself and to find out what was going on. I met representatives of the Orthodox churches, I met representatives of the Anglican and Armenian churches, and they begged, wringing their hands, that finally Europeans should stop asking for special rights for Christian refugees, because Christians are not being persecuted in Syria. At no point have Christians been persecuted in Syria, and they've been living for centuries peacefully in Syria with Muslims. What we're experiencing now is that in the Parliament we are speaking with we're using double standards. Who's talking about the victims of the Turkish airstrikes, the American airstrikes? We're talking only about the victims of the Russian airstrikes, and these aims are actually the American forces are only supporting Daesh because they don't get involved on the ground.
Now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Danjean.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. 2 weeks, as of 2 weeks, there are 2 other countries involved in the Syrian chaos for different reasons, but of course justified via the anti-terror campaign. So that's France and Russia, but we're still not finding a solution to the Syrian conflict. Nobody can call into question the serious threat that ISIS constitutes. But we have to also be aware that no military action will allow us to find an exit to this unless it brings on board diplomacy and politics on a global level, especially if we're thinking about the war against terror and the Syrian crisis. In Syria, we're facing a crisis which is just one among others in terms of the recomposition of the Middle East. There are different fault lines there, and diplomacy should involve all regional stakeholders. Now, Europe, quite modestly, has to be focused on bringing convergence to countries that have different agendas which are lethal to the area. Everybody knows that the Syrian conflict is a Shiite Sunni conflict, and we need to be very determined here. There's no other exit, because otherwise this is going to last for years and years.
Mr. Danjean, would you accept a question from Mr. Etheridge? Go ahead, Mr. Etheridge.
Thank you. Would you agree with me that really the only concerns that anyone from the EU should have regarding Syria is A, to make sure that any support is given to anyone who's trying to crush ISIS, which are the greatest threat currently out there, and B, to ensure that the current mass flow of migrants uncontrolled onto the EU is somehow stemmed and controlled. All else is neo-imperialism. We should not be concerned with anything but two factors.
Herr Kollege Etheridge.
Thank you, Mr. Etheridge. Mr. Danjean.
Well, quite obviously, European governments want to deal with the immediacy of the crisis here, which manifests itself in terrorism and the migration crisis. These are the things that affect us directly, but you're not going to stem the flow of migrants or terrorism through military one-off actions. If you don't have diplomacy, if you don't work on the recomposition of the area with Iran and Saudi Arabia, you're not going to be able to solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Danjean.
The
next speaker is Ms. JAAKONSAARI.
Thank you very much, President. At this point in the discussion, it's very good to recall the numbers of 4 million dead, 1 million injured, 4 million displaced persons, and 1 out of 4 refugees come from Syria. So these are the raw numbers in terms of the migration crisis in Europe. Now, the European Union is asked to provide leadership, and we need to work with the US and Russia to find a solution. Mr. Howitt's suggestion that we can move forward through diplomacy, this is something that we need to work on as well. The policy of crisis management in Europe is inconsistent. Europe is the largest provider of humanitarian aid, but on the other side, we may be falling short on the military side, so we need to move forward in a proper way.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Belder, for 1 minute. Yes, thank you, President. The deployment of military forces by Russia and Iran in the Syrian conflict is now evident. It's legitimation of the terror regime of President Assad. And here we're talking about a political game being played and being imposed. And if you look at the role played by Moscow and Tehran, it goes much further than just the battlefield in Syria, because it has a direct impact on neighbouring countries. And the EU, even if only for the sake of its own security, should do something about stepping up its relations with Israel. Destabilization, terrorist activities by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard speak for themselves. This is the other side of the coin. It is the other side of the coin of the nuclear deal with Iran. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Belder. Would you allow a question from Mrs. Grappini? Yes, Mrs. Grappini, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Dear colleague, you said in your speech that the EU should intensify its military cooperation with Israel. But I haven't heard anything about diplomacy and negotiations. Do you think it is important who kills? Isn't it more important for the European Union to intensify its cooperation with all states through negotiation and diplomacy and not at the military level? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Grappini. Mr. Belder. Yes, thank you very much indeed, colleague Grappini. Well, I said what Israel was doing in the region, and in fact there are a large number of diplomatic contacts being fostered. We have to look at maintaining and expanding stability. In this House we seem to be focusing on one problem, but there are other problems which are not being mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Belder. I know that it's difficult in 30 seconds to reply to a question, but please remember that I have to use my gavel, because you have to ask the question in the framework of 30 seconds and you have to reply within 30 seconds, and I'm not going to allow for any more blue cards now. So, Mr. Paet.
Esiteks on oluline, et Euroopa Liit tuleks.
Thank you, President. It's important that the European Union overcomes its lethargy, and the lethargy that we've been showing towards Syria. The EU has to adopt clear solutions in order to end the war in Syria. We have to work on these solutions. The fact that Russia is now active in Syria, well, that shouldn't surprise anyone. Often we've been taken by surprise by Russia in recent years. In Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine, Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, and now in Syria. The EU is discussing and reflecting and analysing, but at the same time we have to deal with the biggest humanitarian crisis of this century at our doors. The refugee crisis is a consequence of the Syrian war. People are fleeing from ISIS and from Assad, and no-fly zones have to be set up, and we have to have a donor conference to raise money for financing for the refugees. Russia is not just attacking ISIS; they're attacking anyone who's against Assad. So the end of the Syria crisis means that we have to cooperate, but we don't want the Syrian people have to pay for Russian strategic goals.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Matias, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Well, in my country it's said, don't look at what I say, look at what I do. And I think for the nth time now we have to ask the question I've already asked before, and it's a very simple question. Is there, or will there be, 1D, concerted action by European institutions and European governments, not just condemning what's happening, but to bring about a moratorium on the sale of arms to conflict territories? Will there be a moratorium on buying oil from a territory occupied by the Islamic State? Yes or no? We have responsibilities here. We're very good at talking about others, preaching to others about morality and so on, but let's look at our own responsibility here. Mr. Schmit, could you ask me, just for once, please answer this question. What will we do in order to bring about an embargo on purchasing of oil and an embargo on arms sales?
Thank you, Ms. Matthias. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Schaffhauser.
In Syria, our Western positions have become ridiculed, and if France will also become ridiculous, and this is cause for laughter. The Assad army is a conscription army, but they're also the terrorism, the Al-Qaeda branches, the Free Syrian Army, which is supported by foreigners, and ISIL. And there's a conglomerate of warlords from various nationalities which are supported by the West and by the West. They but they will be turning against us because they are being armed by us. This Russian policy feeds into the Syrian dilemma. The idea is to create a reconstruction, but now Russia is being betrayed by us.
Herr Kollege.
Mr. Schaffhauser, would you allow a question from Mr. Denano?
Herr Kollege Denano.
Go ahead.
Approuvez-vous les exactions? Do you approve the actions taken by Bashir al-Assad? Microphone, please.
Les exactions.
Well, let's be clear here. There's propaganda going on here. You know this very well. We began by saying, even before that the Russians were bombing, that they were bombing positions to support Bashir al-Assad. All of that is propaganda, but said that this is not a democratic regime, but we have chosen on the one side Al-Qaeda and the IS, and on the other side a legitimate government, and we need to fight for a legitimate government. Speaker is cut off.
Thank you, Mr. Schaffhauser. Now for 1 minute, Ms. Gabriel.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, almost everything has been said about the conflict in Syria. I think we need to focus on the new elements if we wish to be constructive participants in this debate. I will make 3 points. 2 new countries are now participating. What is important for me is that the international community should seek lasting solutions. We should also not forget the territorial integrity of Syria. The Islamic State is a serious problem. It is a threat to the radicalization of the region. This is why the countries in the region need a clear engagement. In this way, they would ensure prospects for an end to the crisis. And finally, the role of the EU. Our role is to strike a balance in the different process of the distribution of balance in the power. And we can do it through diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gabriel. Now, Ms. Gomez for 1 minute.
The involvement of Russia to support Assad, and Assad is the one who is the origin of the crisis, the root cause. He'll never be part of the solution. And what the Russians are doing is bombing the population of Syria, bombing the rebel groups. But there's also failures of the EU. We haven't done enough to support the minorities there. We haven't done enough to support the terrorism of the Islamic State. Last month we adopted a resolution, but member states have not coordinated, and not even coordinated on humanitarian assistance, in order to provide schools or health care in the refugee camps. We're not even helping the Peshmerga, the Kurds, who are the only ones who are successfully fighting ISIS. And then in Syria, the Kurds are being bombed by Turkey, of President Erdogan, and we've got this nuclear goal with Iran, and that should have opened the door to peace processes for Yemen and Iran, but Yemen and Syria. But Iran is being two-phased here. But we're not doing enough with our CFSP and our security and defence policy.
Thank you, Ms. Gomes. Now, Mr. Demesmaeker for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, after 4 years of civil war, Assad now only controls 1/4 of his territory. His armies are exhausted, decimated, and demoralized. For Damascus, the Russian military intervention comes as a boon, just in time for the geopolitical powers from the region. Putin's bombs are a scourge. With his airstrikes, Putin aims at the failure of the Western intervention in the Middle East. Also, the moderate rebels who are trained with support from anti-IS coalitions are his enemies. But he also wants to strike at the Gulf states for keeping oil prices artificially low. By establishing a coalition with Tehran, Putin is forcing Gulf states to react. Donbass is in ruins. Ukraine is nesting itself in Europe. It's clear that Putin is looking for a new story. This is to further his cult persona and to show what the new MO of the Kremlin is. The West is lagging behind and losing credibility and soft power. It's better not to play that game. Cooperation among all the geopolitical players is therefore the only way to diminish the IS and remove Assad. Let us not forget the tortures and mass murders who support Moscow.
Thank you, Mr. Demesmaeker. Now, Ms. Arnautу for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The present situation in Syria is a disaster, and it's the direct consequence of the crazy policy conducted by Brussels and by most of the Western foreign offices over the last 5 years. Open support or discreet support for terrorist armed groups, the closing of our embassies in Damascus, cutting off all security cooperation with Syrian services, and the refusal to support Syrian authorities in their anti-terrorist combat. and bombing alongside the United States in violation, in breach of international law. The list of errors is too long, and there's no legitimacy left if we want to claim to influence the situation. And Russia, at the request of the Syrian authorities, is acting legitimately and respecting international law, and they are actively involved in Syria against terrorism. We should be pleased that the Russians are finally doing the job that we haven't wanted to do and haven't been able to do. It's high time, and the joy of the Syrians in Damascus when they saw Russian troops arrive is the best illustration of the neglect that we have shown with our policies. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Arnautу.
Kollege Frunzulică, das war 55. Frau Kollegin Arnautü.
Ms. Arnautü, would you accept a question from Mr. Frunzulică? Go ahead, Mr. Frunzulică.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Arnautü,
Thank you very much. Don't you feel that the intervention of Russia has complicated matters in Syria? And at the same time, this war is not bringing peace and not bringing a solution to this situation in Syria. Don't you think that we need an international conference with all of the internal and external and regional stakeholders around the table so that we can finally succeed in bringing peace to Syria?
Bitte.
Go ahead.
Mikro.
Microphone, please.
Microphone.
Microphone.
Voilà. Oui, mon cher collègue,
Dear colleague, what I wanted to say is that you should listen to what the population is saying in Syria. The Syrian people have had enough of this war, of the bombing, the blind bombing by terrorist groups. The Syrians want peace, and they want they want to have a future, and I think it's more important that the decisions are taken closer to home rather than in Riyadh or in Washington. And I'm sure that you have to show intellectual honesty, because so far the Syrian people felt very abandoned and very alone. Thank you.
Frau Kollegin Arnautü.
Ms. Arnautü, would you allow a further question from Mr. Khan?
Bitte, Herr Kollege.
Go ahead, Mr. Khan.
Does my colleague actually trying to tell us that all the mess that we're seeing around the world now in relation to Syria, with 10 million people who are becoming refugees, with 250,000 who have been killed, that this is the fault of EU?
Bitte.
Go ahead.
Mon cher collègue,
Dear colleague, well, perhaps you didn't understand what I was saying. I don't want to say that, because no, of course not. I'm just saying simply you have to respect the sovereignty of peoples. And of course, it's been said various times that we can't approve everything that's happening and everything the Syrian government is doing. But here we're faced with a substantive problem. You have to choose, and you have to fight against Islamic State. Everyone knows that. Everyone says that. So I'm just saying simply that we shouldn't always interfere in what's happening in other states. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Myanmar.
Thank you, President. Syria has become topical again because of the migration crisis and because of Russian military intervention. After 4 years of conflict, there are 250,000 dead, 4 million displaced persons, and they are now the victims of Daesh. Fighting Daesh, or the ISIL, is one of our main priorities. We need to create that as a priority, and the Russians need to do that as well. But the Russian intervention basically is there to support Assad. And there has been a recent meeting between Putin and Obama in New York trying to put an end to the crisis, but this has not borne fruit. Russia now is the one taking the initiatives, and they're not working in line with the international coalition set up by the United States. I think one of the solutions to the crisis, well, is not at hand yet, and a political solution is not at hand, but we must find a solution, and we must support the special envoy of the UN, Speaker GRAAFF.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Myanmar. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Pascu.
With Russia's direct military intervention in Syria, the two major challenges to the EU, Ukraine and ISIL, and the refugee crisis converge. In reality, Russia is fighting along Assad against all its opponents, consolidating his regime and intensifying the refugee exodus while clearing the way on the ground for ISIL. Apart from consolidating its bridgehead and demonstrating big power status, Russia's intervention is attempting to deflect attention from Ukraine, where the implementation of the Minsk II agreement is directly linked to the lifting of the sanctions, which they hope to achieve through the current stalemate. However, simultaneously, Russia has intensified its activism in Moldova, not militarily in the view of the firm reaction to what she does in Ukraine, but by orchestrating a so-called popular protest against the pro-European coalition. This so-called popular protest is only a prelude to a direct move against the current government, aiming to replace it with the pro-Russian one, thus ending Moldova's European aspiration. With Ukraine and Georgia territorially crippled, and with Moldova in balance, what are the prospects for the partnership?
Thank you, Mr. Pascu. Now, Ms. Kalniete for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President, colleagues. Jau nedēļu Krievijas lidmašīnas bombardē Asad pretiniekus Sīrijā. Jau vairākas nedēļas.
For a week now, air attacks have been carried out by Russia in Syria, and for several weeks, Russia has been calling upon the fighters to put down their arms. Mr. Putin's main objective is to engage in horse trading with Europe, because here we're talking about destabilization of the eastern regions, and refugee flows to Europe will increase. And Mr. Putin wants to impose his conditions. Europe shouldn't go along with this. International policy for Syria would have to be to ignore Mr. Putin's adventures in Syria, because here we have to look at the neighbours of Syria, and we have to look at the role of the EU, the US and Russia. We have to put a stop to the war, irrespective of the role being played by Russia. Thank you, Ms. Kalniete. Now, Mr. Khan for 1 minute.
Mr. President, the Syria crisis is the root of two of the most serious global problems right now, the refugee crisis and the threat posed by ISIS. The Russian latest move in Syria are not helpful. They are likely to lead to more and prolonged suffering of Syrian people. Alleviating those global problems requires tackling them at source. So we need a policy that A, stems the killing in Syria, the majority of which is a result of the brutal Assad regime's aerial bombardment. B, reduces the humanitarian impact, including slowing the exodus. C, combats extremism. And D, leads to a political solution. We need to engage Russia and Iran to find a solution urgently. A no-fly zone is the first step to returning the crisis around. It is the only policy option that A, saves lives, B, reduces the exodus, C, reduces the radicalization, and D, makes a political solution more likely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Kelam.
Vielen Dank. 3 points. Trying to avoid direct involvement in the Syrian crisis, the EU has ended in a role of Good Samaritan, taking care of the results of the catastrophe. I think time is to invest in solutions now, and these involve first non-fly zones and safe areas on the ground, and also international donors' confidence. Second, Putin and Assad have lost all credibility. They are not part of the solution, they are part of the problem. Trying to oust ISIS with the help of Assad or Putin means ousting devil with the help of Beelzebub. Third, a red line for the EU should be any solution in Syria cannot be reached at the cost of weakening support for the integrity of Ukraine or watering down the Minsk criteria. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you, Mr. Kelam. Would you accept a question from Ms. Konečná?
You allow a question? Kollegin Konečná.
Ms. Konečná.
Herr Kollege Tannock.
Mr. Tannock, I explained earlier on that if I take the floor away from someone, then I don't allow blue cards because somebody's exceeded their speaking time, and I don't want to reward them for so doing by letting a blue card question be asked. And in fact, I would have had to have withdrawn the floor from a previous speaker, but Mr. Kelam finished on time, which is why I'm allowing the question to be asked.
Vážený pane kolego, dovolte mi...
Dear Mr. Kelam, I would like to ask you, if you say clearly that Putin and Assad are not a part of the solution, then please tell me who is a part of the solution, because Russian airplanes are the only ones that fight in Syria according to international law. They were the only ones to ask their legitimate government if they can fight. This agreement was never requested by the Western coalition. They always behaved like arrogant powers. So who is the part of the solution in Syria, if not a legitimately elected president?
For the opportunity to explain, I think Mr. Assad's government has lost any legitimacy, and Mr. Putin has never asked the UN to start his military operations in Syria.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kelam.
Thank you, Mr. Kelam. Mr. Kelam, would you allow a further question from Ms. JAAKONSAARI?
Bitte, Frau Kollegin.
Go ahead, Ms. JAAKONSAARI.
Thank you, President. Thank you for that very analytic statement, but I think it is a bit confusing to hear all of that pessimism that you had vis-a-vis finding a diplomatic solution to this crisis. Perhaps through Iran and a more constructive dialogue through Russia, maybe that would be a solution.
Mr. Kelam.
Kiitoksia paljon kysymyksestä.
Thank you for the question.
Not against diplomatic solution, but what I try to explain is that the EU has lost opportunity to be actively involved in diplomatic solution 4 years ago. We have just been observing the problem and even not paying enough for aid to help refugees. I am fully for diplomatic solution, but it can't be reached with the help of counting murderers like Assad.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Kelam.
Thank you, Mr. Kelam. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Lietz.
Sehr geehrter Herr
President, Mr. Schmit, the agreement with Iran has demonstrated that diplomatic efforts can lead to a success, even when they appear to be hopeless. This is a lesson we must bear in mind in relation to the civil war in Syria. We need a political process which will bring all of the parties involved in the conflict to the table. This is the only way that we can put a stop to the murders. Only a political solution will permit the Syrians to live together in peace once again. The unilateral military intervention by Russia is nothing new. I have been pointing out for months now that Russia has been holding a protective hand over Assad and has to be included in resolving the solution. This is not to doesn't have anything to do with sanctions and Ukraine. And in fact, what we're seeing is that Mr. Assad is able to continue to terrorize the populations of entire cities with barrel bombs on a daily basis. We should not forget that it is the terror on the part of the Assad regime that has driven millions of Syrians, and continues to do so, to flee from their homeland. I'd like to thank the High Representative for the diplomatic efforts that have been put into resolving this. Thank you, Mr. Lietz. Now, Mr. GRZYB.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. Ogromna skala cierpienia.
Huge scale of suffering at the doorstep of Europe should be put to an end, you said, Minister, and we agree with that. Yesterday we debated the problem of refugees in Europe. Of course, what is missing in our response is what we are looking for today. Because Syria is a part of the problem and is the root cause of refugee crisis. We are trying to solve the problem with local actors who have different interests. With international community, it doesn't really work. Russia gets involved, but we still remember that it may also be a part of solution to the Ukraine problem, and we wouldn't like that to happen. Assad regime is responsible for that because today's refugees are those who were forced to flee away 2 years ago. We have to put an end to the war and to terror and to the Islamist state because there are huge sufferings like the 12-year-old boy who was crucified.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Group. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Cozzolino. I believe that the initiative of Russia does not resolve, will not bring stability, will not resolve this conflict with the Islamic State. We do have credibility, we as Europe, as the European Union, and above all with the leadership of Federica Mogherini, we have a role to play over the next few weeks and months, because it's necessary that we now make way for diplomacy, for the spoken word. It's not enough to send in armies. And we had to start dialogue again with the United States, Russia, and with the states in the region in order to strike a new balance and assure three things which are fundamental. An initiative which is necessary immediately to military defeat and politically defeat Islamic State in the whole area. Secondly, we need to ensure that there's a transition period. We need, and we know from history over the years and months, that leaving a vacuum, and Syria is a vacuum that teaches us this, that leaving a vacuum will mean that other people rush in and other solutions are found. No, we have to guarantee a transition, and that has to involve Assad and then an after-Assad period. And finally, the big problem of the refugees. Thank you very much, Mr. Cozzolino. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Gahler. Thank you very much, President. I don't believe that we Europeans had different interests in the Syria issue. No, my impression is that Europeans are of one mind, but so far we haven't drawn the conclusions and the need to do more than just providing humanitarian aid or taking in refugees here and there. We need to do more than that. All global and regional stakeholders need to be brought around a table. The status quo is not good for people in Syria. It's not good for the neighbours. It's not good for, it's not sustainable for global players either, and it's not helpful that Russia is now helping Assad regime and bombing on behalf of Assad regime, and Assad regime is the main reason for the flight of refugees. If you look at Russian planes in Latakia and Russian ships in the port, well, I'm sure nonetheless, despite the fact that there can be no future for Assad, the vast majority of Syria would not accept, even if it has support from left and right, the Syrian people would not support the idea of Assad having a future.
Thank you, Mr. Gahler. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Plenković.
Hvala lijepa predsjedavajući. Ministre Schmit, hvala na uvodnim izlaganjima I nadam se da će Vijeće imati kvalitetne zaključke.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for those introductory words. I hope that you'll be able to arrive at a good conclusion next week. The Syrian crisis is the largest crisis we're facing in our neighborhood policy. We've got 4 million refugees, thousands dead, and all of the regional stakeholders are involved in the problem. There's Israel, and Saudi Arabia, but of course it's a Shiite-Sunni conflict, and we need to combat that. The Russian intervention is to support Assad and his regime. Secondly, to create a rival with the international coalition led by the United States, and thirdly, to find a solution Russian style, i.e. not allowing the destruction of this authoritarian regime. And so the European Union needs to play a key role politically and diplomatically to find a diplomatic solution.
Thank you. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Turkish. President, I would like to express my sincere recognition of Father Andrzej Halemba, who is providing church-based humanitarian aid in the home country of the refugees in Syria. In his opinion, not just the refugees have to be given help, but also those who want to stay at home. It is incumbent upon politicians to put in place the conditions to make this possible. Drawing a parallel with the refugees from communism, in one of his statements, President Lech Walesa also put forward arguments in favour of staying at home. Like many of his compatriots, he too did not leave his home so that he could do something to change the situation there and could fight for a viable, livable future. Syria cannot move to Europe. The real solution is not emigration, but sorting out the political situation and establishing peace and security. The people of Syria's right to stay in their homeland has to be guaranteed rather than its right to emigrate. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Turkish. Now, Ms. Theocharous for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The mistaken choices on behalf of the US on many occasions, the absence of action by the European Union have not allowed us to fill the democratic vacuum left by the Assad regime. We haven't been able to prevent a terrible civil war in Syria, and therefore we've actually allowed Islamic State to grow and to cause terrible catastrophes with a real humanitarian disaster as a consequence. And then, of course, we look at the situation, the position of Turkey and the position of Russia only making the situation worse. Russia has started bombing Syria. But I think with the agreement of the US, in my view, and now Russian planes have violated Turkish airspace, and we see that the situation is becoming very worrying indeed. And once again, we are blind. Turkey is bombing everyday Kurdish civilians. The planes and army are breaching the territorial waters and the airspace of Cyprus, and everyone looks the other way. And Turkey is part of the problem, and NATO doesn't react, and the European Union just accepts the blackmail of President Erdogan, who has difficulty in respecting commitments he's entered into. What we need to do is set up an international conference so that we can bring about a ceasefire and a transitional period, the adoption of a roadmap, and then free elections with the international observation. All of that is necessary in order to protect the population.
Thank you. I know that the topic is extremely important, but it's also very important that we should take account of time. And I am now going to give the floor to Mr. Peterle. Thank you.
Thank you. Syria is about several wars at the same time. It's not only a political and economic power game in Syria and the region, it is also a clash of civilizations and a religious war. We are at war and we are co-responsible. We bear responsibility to the people of Syria, and we are responsible also in terms of the future of our own people. The European Union, with all of its economic, political, cultural and other clout, cannot afford to just be a backup player or an observer. Our ambitions have to be to establish peace in a pragmatic and all-inclusive manner with all those who should be seated behind the negotiating table. A prerequisite for this is a clear strategy and political will which takes into account the whole picture. We will not be able to solve this problem if each of us aims just at their own target. No, we will be successful only if we do away with the problem at its root. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Mr. Pabriks, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam. I believe in the European Union, but I equally believe in the need of self-criticism. And Syria is a good example, good a lesson for us, how we failed because of our inactivity, our passivity, and our wishful thinking in foreign policy. At this moment, we are dealing with the refugee crisis, which is only the top of this iceberg of the failed foreign policy. And we have been listening for the cries of neighbour beating his wife for 4 years, and now when the wife is knocking on our door, we are either sending it to neighbour house because ours is full, or simply telling that we have been very welcoming her inside. No, we have to deal with foreign policy issues, and unfortunately those who were denying the dealing with Turkey now are happy cooperating or trying to cooperate with Putin and Assad. We need an active policy together with the United Nations. We need an active policy not only in capitals but also in Brussels and European Commission. Until we will not succeed with this, we will fail eternally. Thank you.
A blue card question from seat 854 from Mr. Dorkowski.
May I put a question to you, distinguished colleague? I'm in favor of a more active action on the part of the European Union and Western powers as well. Are you recommending something that is close to my heart, that is to take responsibility for Syria but without Russia's intervention? What is the idea that you're putting forward?
Mr. Fabriks, you have the floor.
Well, I don't think we can speak about European army or something like this, but obviously our Western coalition have been failing because we declined to intervention when the red lines were crossed, what Obama suggested. I did not see any good proposals from our European Union side until Putin made a move with a horse. And he is now the leading guy to which we would have to obey. So, possibility no-fly zone, better cooperation with Turkey, additional money to refugees. Unfortunately, there is not a good solution, but better now than 4 years too late.
Now that brings us to the end of the speakers, and now we move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. Hopefully my microphone will continue working. Now, honourable colleague Mr. Bogovic.
Thank you very much. As we know, a war has been raging in Syria for 4 years, a war with many victims and a war with a wave of refugees that have come to Europe, and only now have we woken up to the extent of this war and to the global consequences of this war. Syria is a clear example of how to not conduct foreign policy. It shows that after destroying Iraq, we created a vacuum for terrorist groups, for barbaric groups that do not respect human life nor thousands of years of heritage. So the key players, from the United States to the European Union, from Russia to Saudi Arabia, from Iran to Turkey, all of them have to stop playing the game of global interests, but have to assume their responsibility and provide for peace and stability in this part of the world. Otherwise, terrorism will spread all over the world.
Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mr. Bostinaru. And please take account of the fact that because of a traffic jam, although he was on the list, he wasn't able to arrive in time to give his speech, and unfortunately only has 1 minute at his disposal now.
Very much. So 1 minute, you mean? Thank you. It was supposed to be 2.
I would like to underline that in the context of the debates at the General Assembly of the UN, Syria was one of the main topics on the agenda, maybe the most important topic. But afterwards, from Berlin, Paris and London, we got messages that were sort of conflicting, in nuance at least. And there are differences between these messages regarding the platform that Ms. Mogherini proposed. I would like to underline the need for a strategic approach and pragmatic approach in this case regarding the role of an international approach, a coalition in this case. We have to look at Russia's intentions. They say they want to consolidate the Allies' positions, but their actions are unpredictable and inconsistent with their declarations. They attacked Assad's political adversaries and not ISIS, and that confirms once again our doubts regarding their engagement. Pax Russica cannot be a solution for Syria and for the Middle East. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. The next speaker is Marias.
President, the situation in Syria is beyond all control. The civil war is exacerbated and refugees are invading neighbouring countries and Greece. This is a region where chemical weapons have been used, civilians have been bombed. These are daily practices, and the international community has proven it's unable to help to resolve the problem. opposition groups, opposition rebel groups want to put an end to the Assad regime, but then there's also the problem of ISIS, which is killing civilians and destroying the architectural patrimony of the area. So, so the ISIS is trying to destroy the cultural heritage and is trying to create a tsunami of refugees which will submerge Greece and other European countries. Greece has already been very hard hit by the migratory flows, and that's why the European Union has to draw conclusions from the errors of the past and has to take diplomatic initiatives in order to find a viable solution to the problem in Syria.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Mr. Jakovčić.
Gospođo predsjedavajuća, varamo se ako mislimo da će...
Thank you very much. I think we're deluding ourselves if we think that the war in Syria will come to a speedy end, but we're also wrong if we believe that Russia will not be there to support the Assad regime. The reason I'm saying this is because I think we need to be realistic here. We shouldn't repeat the errors of the past. We shouldn't underestimate the situation. Of course, Russia is going to protect the Assad regime, and it's only the broad coalition that will be able to help us out. The European Union is playing a minor role in the conflict, but we have to take the responsibility for the situation in Syria, to solve the problem in Syria and also the migration.
And Ms. Konečná.
Thank you. I'm very happy to see that the European Parliament has been dealing with important topics like Syria and Libya, but I would prefer to have more specific solutions for the crisis. We should step up diplomatic and humanitarian efforts in Syria, but please do not forget that the Middle East problem should be resolved in the Middle East. We should not be a messiah that knows much better than local governments what the region needs. Recently, we have often seen that external interventions, mostly by the US, destabilize whole regions. If we know something about this region, is that it has a long memory. If we are diplomatic and present as humanitarian helpers in the region, we may improve our reputation.
The next speaker is Mr. Epitideos.
Mr. Epitideos, you have the floor. In 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. The wrong politics that have been followed by the European Union on Syria is very broadly responsible for the situation which prevails in the country and has prevailed there for 5 years. We tried to overthrow Assad right from the outset, but it was clear that that was impossible. But that means that the European Union has adopted a policy that's only worsened the situation. We've become accomplices, really, of Assad, and we've actually abandoned our responsibilities, and other countries have occupied the vacuum left by the European Union. So the only thing we've gained is actually that we've ended up suffering the consequences of this war. Hundreds of thousands dead, strengthening of Islamic State. These are the consequences, and then the huge migratory flow towards Turkey, and then hundreds of thousands moving from Turkey into Greece and then into Europe, and then decisive intervention now militarily by Russia. So all that remains for us to do in order to resolve the problem of Syria is to collaborate now, cooperate with Russia.
Our next speaker is Mr. Sogor. Thank you. Dealing with the conflict in Syria is something which has to be dealt with by the countries in the region as well as the US and Russia, because what we're seeing is that large streams of migrants are going to Europe, particularly the Western European countries. The EU apparently cannot take decisions which would have an impact on the events unfolding in Syria. The member states, rather than taking account of their own interests, are taking decisions in the Council on the basis of qualified majority voting, and the countries in the east of Europe, well, it would seem that their opinion doesn't count for anything. A confederal solution would appear to be important, but for that you need two things. You have to put an end to the war first, and you have to make sure that the rights of minorities are guaranteed. Thank you. Our final speaker is Mr. Caputo.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. In Syria, a very complex war is underway, and unfortunately the decision of the Russian government to get involved militarily doesn't help at all. On the contrary, all it does is further complicate the situation and increase the crisis. The war in Syria has been going on for more than 4 years, and that's the main cause of the humanitarian crisis taking place within Europe now. Millions of people have left their homes in these years, and 250,000 people have died. This is a war which has become more and more confused and complicated, and its political solution seems to be still a long way off. What we need is a diplomatic solution. Europe must carry on working in that direction, and we cannot repeat in Syria the areas we've made in the past. I'm thinking about what happened in Libya. We have to bring about a political transition which will free the country from dictatorship, and at the same time avoid the gulf of a political vacuum. And history has taught us that just using arms to resolve these issues only leads to death and ruin.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot give the floor to any other members in spite of the importance of the topic. Now I'd like to call upon Minister Schmit to speak on behalf of the Council.
You have the floor.
Mrs. Chair, I first want to thank you for this very rich debate and for all the views which you have expressed, and which have also reflected the complexity but also the dangers of this conflict. We are all aware that the internal as well as the external dimensions of this conflict just make it more complex and more difficult, and that there is no easy solution to it. But we are also all aware that ending the Syrian conflict is deeply in the EU's interest, because it affects the stability of our southern neighbourhood, not to talk about the refugee crisis we talked a lot yesterday. And therefore the Union is actively working on finding a solution, a political solution to the Syrian conflict, as I mentioned it and as I described it in my previous intervention. The EU has indeed to do everything on the political and diplomatic front to contribute to that end. And certainly combating the terrorist groups, and namely Daesh, is a very, very important element in that. We also are very committed to support actively the UN-led peace efforts. We have to talk to all actors involved in this conflict, to all external actors, including Russia. How can we come to a solution now without talking to the Russians? But we have to make clear that Russia has to commit to finding a political solution that is inclusive and will strengthen, not weaken, the fight against terrorism. Talking about a political solution, what do we mean by that? Well, our long-standing position is that a lasting solution to the conflict can only be achieved through a Syrian-led political process leading to a transition. These are the terms of the Geneva Communiqué, and for it to be realized, it will require the consent of all the Syrian parties, since Geneva foresees the participation of all groups and segments of society in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. And This brings the debate on Syria to a conclusion. We now move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the Vice President High Representative of the Commission's statement on the situation in Turkey. First of all, I'd like to give the floor to Minister Schmit. So he will be speaking on behalf of the Commission Vice President and High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Go ahead, you have the floor, sir.
Please use your micro. Micro, please. Micro.
It's okay? Works. So, Madam Chair, honourable members, first I would like to thank you for giving the Council the opportunity to exchange views with you on the situation in Turkey at this pivotal moment for the country and for the whole region. The Middle East is in turmoil, including the crisis in Syria. We just had a large exchange on that, and the presence of Daesh in the region, and namely also in Iraq. The rest of the region is also facing dramatic challenges, from Yemen to Libya. The human tragedies in the Mediterranean, the threats posed by terrorist groups, and the multiple conflicts in our neighbourhood are all issues we can only tackle in cooperation with our partners. Turkey is indeed a strategic partner for Europe. We need to work together with Turkey like partners if we want to effectively tackle all these crises, and in particular the Syrian one. This cooperation is not only possible, it is absolutely necessary. There are so many interests we share, starting from the most important one, peace and stability in our common region. For this reason, we have started to increase and deepen further our engagement with Turkey. The visit of President Erdogan to Brussels and his meetings with President Tusk and President Juncker on Monday is a reminder that our dialogue with our Turkish partners at the highest possible level is in the interest of both. The situation in Syria and Iraq has called for the reinforcement of our cooperation on foreign policy issues and counter-terrorism. The refugee crisis that we are facing in the region shows very clearly that we have a common challenge in managing this dramatic situation. Turkey's efforts to host more than 2 million Syrian and Iraqi refugees deserve not only our approval but also, most of all, our full support and solidarity. The Union is providing financial help, some 176 million by the Commission for Direct Aid to Refugees. The Council's recent decision to increase the EU's financial contribution, the Commission's commitments in this respect, and the increased contribution of Member States should help putting our forces together. A couple of weeks ago, the European Union's heads of state and government stressed that there is precisely a pressing need to reinforce our cooperation with Turkey on managing these issues. The challenges we face due to the refugee crisis made it necessary to significantly step up our cooperation on migration and border management. This means also that we have to pursue even further our dialogue towards visa liberalisation. We also need to further develop operational cooperation with a view to preventing illegal migratory flows in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, and to fighting smugglers' networks responsible for the loss of so many lives at our borders. Which is why, on the occasion of President Erdogan's visit on Monday, the President of the Commission handed over to him a draft action plan for stepping up cooperation between the EU and Turkey on support of refugees and migration management. The draft plan, which has been made publicly available on the Commission's website, is now being discussed with the Turkish side to reach agreement on the details. But our challenges go beyond that.